Family disputes can make us feel isolated and vulnerable. Maybe you're going through a divorce or a legal dispute about your kids. Perhaps you've spent hours on Google or have even posted anonymously on Facebook to see what others have to say. But are you getting the actual information and support that you're looking for? Our podcast, Legal Lounge, aims to dispel misinformation and downright bad legal information to empower anyone with questions about their family, their children, their finances, their marriage, and the law. As a team focused exclusively on family law matters, we aim to help listeners not only with the information they need, but also with the hope that their situation has a solution. Short disclaimer, please note this podcast is for educational purposes only, and the information should not be relied upon as legal advice or for legal purposes. Welcome back to the Legal Lounge. I come to you with a slightly heavier heart just because I know a number of changes in our political sphere is now influencing our legal sphere. And I am the first to tell you, look, I went to George Washington University for my undergraduate studies. It's arguably the most politically active school. We had rallies on any and everything all day, every day. I mean, including discussing sporks in the cafeteria. I joke on that because today's topic is not a joking matter. And it very much is, how are the laws possibly going to change for a number of individuals in our country? Now, I'm licensed in North Carolina. Tiffany Byrd, who is here with me today, is licensed in North Carolina and South Carolina as attorneys. We are family law attorneys. And although we will be discussing topics outside of family law, it all comes back to the family. And so without further ado, I want to talk on the concept of family planning, what happens to married folks and non-married folks if they happen to be in a same-sex relationship. I think the very first thing to touch on, well, hi, Tiffany. Let me say hi.
Hey,
go ahead.
I
I think the first thing is for the listener to recognize what type of political system we live in. And that political system is a federalism. And what I mean by federalism is that there are federal laws and a federal system that is separate from state laws and a state system. So yes, we have our national Congress, we have our U.S. Congress, we have our U.S. Senate, we have our Supreme Courts at the U.S. Appellate and Supreme Court level, and we have our U.S. Executive Branch, right? We have the president, who is the person at the top of that rank, and then therefore thereafter a number of different administrations and agencies, and that's at the federal level. Separate from that, we have our state courts. And so, yes, we here in North Carolina, we have a North Carolina Supreme Court. We have a North Carolina Court of Appeals. And then we have a number of district courts and superior courts. And so in family law, your first courtroom, if you will, that you would enter would be that local county district court. However, even if you're sitting in front of a judge that happens to live in the same county as you, that doesn't mean that those laws and legal changes at that federal law are not having implications on you. Right. And I say that because I think we often get confused as a society, me too, like even an attorney who practices law all day, every day, about that dichotomy between the federal level and the state level. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's confusing. Like you said, it's confusing for us to kind of keep track of. So imagine anybody who doesn't do this day in, day out, trying to understand, well, on this side, it said that you could do it, but then they're saying, no, you can't. And I don't understand how you have those two for the same subject.
Yeah, especially when the headlines that you hear all day, every day, out there, and you're like, well, how does that affect me? And it seems like no one's giving you a clear answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'll bring up the elephant in the room, which is the Roe v. Wade being overturned, because that was law across the nation when we were born.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
And so we went to law school and learned it as legal understandings and legal history and legal precedent.
Right.
That we then, both as a lawyer at the local level, but also at the state and national level, had to follow.
Right.
for generations.
Correct. And like you bank on those things because you're like, oh, that's settled. We're never going to have to touch that again. So
Mm-hmm.
this isn't a question anymore.
Yeah.
And then we had the Dobbs decision come out, which essentially said, no, never mind. We're going to
Yep.
return that thing that we thought was finished and solved. We're going to say, no, each state can decide what they want to do.
And I want to point that out because I think because I do think this is a misunderstanding at
Yeah.
the society level, is that the common person believes that women's rights were stripped completely.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to posit, not exactly.
Right.
What the Dobbs decision is that it's no longer a constitutionally protected right to decide whether or not to have an abortion at whatever stage, but rather a state's decision, going back to that federalism discussion I just commented on.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? It means you have to actually look toward your state laws where you live
Right.
on what protections or possibly not protections
Right.
that exist.
Exactly. So you have to look to your state to say, okay, what are the rules when it comes to abortion? That's why you'll hear some states talk about their sanctuary states or their safe states because they have codified one way or another saying, no, we're still protecting your ability to choose whether or not you have an abortion and then what rules go along with that.
Yeah.
There are also some states who are more restrictive and have said, no, those are not going to be allowed under either any circumstances or very limited circumstances.
And go one step further, provide for certain sanctions and possibly criminal prosecution to anyone who helps them.
Correct.
And that's unique to their state, and it's not across the board in every state.
Right.
And we touch on that because that was a very, very historic change to the constitutional rights that us lawyers were trained in law school in our lifetime. Like that was a huge change.
Right.
Right. And so with the recent election and different understandings of how the nation is going to move forward, there's also this question about the more recent Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell. Can you describe that a little bit more to the listener?
So I remember where I was when that one came out.
Yeah.
And I was actually in a meeting with somebody and immediately started crying.
Really?
So I'm sure I looked like a crazy person.
Yeah.
I'm sure that I did, but I was like, you know what? I'm sorry. This essentially the court has come out and said that you cannot deny same-sex couples from being married. You cannot deny allowing them the opportunity to join in this institution that has been held up as being very important to how families are built.
Yeah.
And you can't reserve that to just those who are in heterosexual relationships. So I know for years at that point, we had situations where clerks weren't allowing those applications to go through, or you could only do it in certain states. And then it's like, well, I'll do a domestic partnership instead. So giving something other than a marriage. And so with Obergefell, you didn't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
The states weren't allowed to do that. So essentially the federal system stepped in and said, nope, you have to honor this across the board. You have to offer this across the board. You can no longer withhold that from these families.
And when we say withhold, we mean that the United States Supreme Court is saying that you as a human being in the United States have a constitutional protection to that right to marry.
Correct.
Which cannot be rejected because you are in a same-sex relationship.
Correct.
That's the current law.
Yes.
Right? But it's only been in place for a couple years. It's a lot newer.
2015.
Right? Yeah. So, and Tiffany and I both went to law school before that, just to clarify for the listener. So this is new law for us, unlike Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Building relationships is a natural part of life. But how does the law affect those relationships? Do you want to marry your significant other, but have cold feet from the many divorce horror stories out there? Are you preparing for a custody battle against your ex? That is where Modern Legal comes in. We offer education and knowledge about the law when it affects the relationships near and dear to your heart. To learn more about how family law affects your family, book a consultation with an attorney of our Modern Legal team by visiting our website, emailing us, or calling us at 704-286-6302. Check out the information about Modern Legal Services at modernlegalnc.com. And so, what are some of the concerns now with certain discussions, especially that have been aligned with the administration that has been elected into office?
So some of the concerns are that they are going to, like they did for Roe v. Wade, have the situation come back up in front of the Supreme Court and then reverse their decision on whether or not the right to marry is a constitutionally protected right. If that were to happen, then that right itself goes back to the states, similar to what happened with the right to abortion. So
Hmm.
you're looking at each individual state and saying, does this state allow for those who are in same sex relationships to be married?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because here in North Carolina specifically, there was a constitutional amendment that said the right to marry should be reserved to a man and a woman.
Correct.
And then when Obergefell came down,
Hmm.
the state had to change a number of its laws and practices.
Hmm.
And so that included extending domestic violence protections to same sex romantic relationship
Hmm.
partners, that included certain parental rights
Hmm.
to children. And that included a number of the marital rights
Hmm.
that we help our clients not only understand, but then address when they're going through a separation or divorce, or even
Right.
getting ready to get married in a prenup.
Hmm.
And so, how do you see, if it were to happen? I'm not saying it is,
Right.
but how do you see Obergefell being overturned affecting us here in North Carolina?
So I think one of the most important pieces to remember is if that were to happen, it is not happening January 21st.
That's fair.
Like there is still a process that would have to be followed for it to reach the Supreme Court, for arguments to be held, and for them to come out with a decision. So there would be a significant lead time to know, hey, we may be headed in that direction.
Hmm.
But if that were to take place, I think some of the concerns are, okay, well, what happens to, like, if I'm the only person whose name is on the deed, I'm married, but are you still going to recognize my marriage if this gets overturned? Like,
Hmm.
does all of this go away?
Hmm.
And if that were the case, how how do we deal with the things that we have?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
how do we deal with property? How do we deal with accounts? When we go to the hospital, like, are we going to have problems there? So
Hmm.
it's all of the more day to day things that you're starting to look at, and even just passing on everything that you've worked for,
Hmm.
saying, well, I thought that this was going to be a done deal. This wasn't going to be a problem. And now,
Now it
do I
is.
have to
Mhm.
replan? Do I have to reorganize how this is set up so that my loved ones don't have problems? Am I
Yeah.
able to protect them still?
Yeah. And go one step further, if the constitutional right to marry is stripped,
Hmm.
just in generally speaking, it goes back to the states. The states addressing the issue and fixing up all this mess and confusion is also not going to happen overnight.
No.
It could take years, if not decades, really,
Hmm.
to unravel some of the issues, because state legislatures also work relatively slow.
Slow. Hmm.
Yeah.
They're a bureaucracy too, and
Yeah.
bureaucracies are not quick. I
No.
don't know of
Yeah.
one that is.
Yeah.
So, and then for something like this that is such a hot button issue, and people have very strong feelings about it one way or another, I think that just prolongs the ability to
Mm.
make any kind of change one way or another.
Yeah. And let me say, especially here in the legal lounge, we're not here to say a certain political position is necessarily
No.
correct. It's more, or right or wrong. It's more about the legal implications.
Hmm.
Because when you change the law, it's not about one person's belief versus another person's belief, or one person's political party over another person's political party.
Hmm.
Honestly, again, I like to stay out of politics.
Yeah.
But as an attorney, I have clients that have families, that have been married, that have children, that have investment accounts, that have
Hmm.
houses. how do I then, as an attorney, take care of my clients and their legal, financial, parental needs,
Mhm.
considering that the law could be in a juxtaposition that no one knows what's going on.
Right.
That's why
Exactly.
we're really having this conversation today,
Yeah.
because it is a huge question mark.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we do have to turn to at that point is looking at the marriage, the relationship, any joint ventures that these two people
Mhm.
have, thinking about it in business terms
Yes.
and looking at, okay, well, what ways would we be able to secure and protect businesses
Mhm.
to make sure that we have the right protections in place?
And although I know looking at a romantic relationship in any capacity
Mhm.
as solely a business relationship,
Mhm.
it probably like hits your gut a little,
Yeah.
right? Like you're
It's
like,
like, but
oh,
no, no,
it's
it's
not.
just, and I'm like,
There's love. We believe in love. And
right.
yes, I mean, you and I believe in love. We're both married, right?
Absolutely.
It's not that.
Yeah.
It's the fact, from a legal perspective, to your point,
Mhm.
we have to shift the lens through which we're addressing these problems.
Mhm.
So yeah, that brings us to the next point of what are some family planning tools that we can put into place when the laws are not really giving us much guidance.
Right. Or even just to kind of say, like, extra protection. If this were to fall, I know this is going to be my safety
Good
net.
point.
You
Good
know what I
point.
mean?
Yeah.
And the first things I like looking at the estate planning section. So, looking at powers of attorney, both for your financial matters as well as your healthcare needs. So, setting up a durable financial power of attorney so that you can name somebody who is able to act on your behalf for your legal things. So, going to the bank, signing tax returns, filing those things, um, signing, heck, if you identified the house that you wanted to buy, but now you're gone and you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do?
Hmm.
The durable power of attorney could allow that other person to sign on your behalf in that
Hmm.
circumstance. So that's one way to protect those interests. The healthcare power of attorney, I think, is extremely, extremely important. That
Hmm.
is where you name somebody who doctors and other healthcare professionals will look at to make decisions for you when you are incapacitated. So maybe you've been in a car accident and you're unconscious, or something like that's going on where you can't make your own healthcare decisions. There's somebody that they know they can turn to and say, okay, what are we going to do for this person?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then hopefully you've had those conversations about, well, what would you want to have done in
Yeah.
those circumstances?
Yeah. And it'll keep a judge or
Out of
any
it.
third
Out of it.
party out of it.
Out of it.
Hmm.
And sometimes, like, if the person that you're choosing as your healthcare agent, which is what that their title would be at that point, that doesn't necessarily need to be a spouse. It doesn't necessarily need to be a family member. It may be a really good friend.
Hmm.
If you didn't have that in place, they may not have been the person that that doctor turned to.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
so, for example, going back to, if marriages were no longer recognized, the spouse that you have had for, 5, 10, 15 years, whatever the situation is, if that were to fall and we don't know if they would still be able to hold that position, if they were named as your healthcare power of attorney, then they would still have that ability to do that,
Exactly.
regardless of what the status of the relationship was. You really want to start looking at, okay, who is the person,
Yeah.
not what relationship do you have that
Yeah.
gives them this ability.
Yeah. And you're not relying on the state's marital laws
No.
to create the protections that come with marriage,
Hmm.
but rather you're looking at documents, contracts, estate planning documents,
Yep.
family law planning documents,
Hmm.
and all of those where, yes, everyone will have to sign off on and will be held in a very important place.
Yep.
But once those are signed and enforceable, that's what
That's it.
must be followed
Hmm.
by our judicial system and our courts. And
Exactly.
so you're no longer relying on the state's laws, which could be up in the air and really
Hmm.
not defining much of anything at
Correct.
some point if
Right.
something were to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not looking at the relationship anymore. You are looking at, okay, well, what name is on this paper
Yeah.
and what has been signed.
Yeah.
So now powers of attorney only help while you are still living, but you're
Hmm.
not able to make decisions for yourself. It's also very important that you have a will that dictates, okay, all of these things that I have amassed while I was living, they now have to go somewhere when I have passed away.
Hmm.
the state has default rules about where those should go if you don't have your own rules written down to say this is supposed to go to this person and this person and this person. And so the will allows you to do that, regardless of what the relationship is. You can put anybody you want
Mhm.
in that will and say, I want them to have X. They're going to be able to do this.
Mhm.
Um, so that's the will. Another option for those who are really maybe more sensitive to being private, they may want to look into doing a trust because
Mhm.
then the trust can do all of those same things, but you don't have to file that with court. So those decisions remain private.
Mhm.
And for a lot of people, that's very important as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Because in the trust, which
Mhm.
has its own name,
Yep.
which by the way, you can even get creative with the name,
You
right?
can.
Like a lot of
You
people go ahead and
can.
put it
Yeah.
in
Like,
the Jones's Family Trust, but
yeah.
you could put a fun name on it.
Hmm.
And I say that because it effectively, as you're saying a moment ago, it keeps your privacy, keeps the state and the judiciary out of your business.
Hmm.
I like that.
Yeah.
I'm all about privacy in that sense.
Exactly.
So,
So, like those are some things that I think are really really
mm,
important.
mm,
Also, when it comes to making sure that the documents that you have that they are fully representative of who you are. So for some, maybe your documents don't match how you present to the world. So you want to update your documents to make sure that, for example, a gender marker is more appropriate to who you are.
mm,
There are ways that we can do that, especially like your passport is
mm,
extremely quick to be able to do because it's you self-attesting I am X, and we now have the option to say male, female, or there is an X marker that you can
mm,
choose if you so wish. And I know up until the conclusion of this current administration, they are trying to make sure that as many of those are processed as possible because we don't know if, again, there may be some changes with the new administration
different.
on what
Yep.
the rules are.
Yep. So, yeah, and that's a great point because there are laws and then there's
Hmm.
administration procedures.
Right.
So it's definitely something to talk about
Hmm.
with your family law attorney and your
Yeah.
circle, if you will. Shifting to the marital family law planning and possibly divorce side, I
Hmm.
think two tools that I was thinking of as well was when it comes to real property, here in North Carolina specifically,
Hmm.
when two spouses, again, who are already married and are considered married by the state's laws, go out to buy real property, it's presumed that that real property will be held by a joint tenancy by the entireties.
Hmm.
And what that means is that both parties, both spouses, own the property 100%.
Right.
So if one person passes away, it's okay. The other person doesn't even have to go through probate.
Mm-mm.
Doesn't even have to be defined in a will, technically.
No.
That other person will own that property 100%. And that, I mean, just think about it. If your significant other, your plus one, passes away, you definitely don't want to be worried about losing your housing
Right.
as well
Right.
as you're going through the funeral and the grief. Um, that same structure can happen to in North Carolina to non-married individuals,
Hmm.
and what we call it is slightly different, but it's called joint ownership
Hmm.
with the right of survivorship.
Yep.
And it's basically the same thing,
Exactly.
but it's just between parties who may or may not be considered married.
Hmm.
I know, and just gonna make a confession here. Me and my now husband actually did that when we were purchasing real property because our purchase happened to be a few months before the date of our wedding.
Yeah.
And we did that because we were planning on it becoming part of the marital estate. It's
Hmm.
just, it can't become part of the marital estate
Because it
before
doesn't
you get married.
exist yet.
Yeah, there's no marriage
Exactly.
yet.
Right.
And so that was one way how two separate individuals,
Hmm.
technically under the eyes of the law, can create a ownership,
Hmm.
specifically in real property, that mirrors the type of ownership between spouses.
Yes.
So that is a really important tool out there, especially as same-sex couples move forward.
Hmm.
Maybe have that there just in case.
Yeah.
And then separate from that is also what we would call the cohabitation agreement.
Hmm.
And the cohabitation agreement is actually nothing new.
Yeah.
It's something that family law attorneys have been using for a long time, not only with actually same-sex
Right.
relationships and couples, but for roommates.
Just
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like anybody who's like, listen, we're going into this thing together. We need to have protections for what may or may not come.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the other tools are not available to us because that doesn't fit our situation.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we are a country that we love to be able to contract. And so long
Mhm.
as you come to the table knowing you can contract with just about anything, and that
Yep.
would be one of those scenarios.
Yeah. That right to contract. I know contract law is one of those requirements first year law
Oh,
school.
yeah. Don't remind me, please.
I know. Oh, contract law.
Yeah.
But it's such an integral piece of the American system when it comes
Hmm.
to laws. And it's actually a beautiful thing because, yeah, you can contract to almost anything so long as it's not against public policy.
Right.
And so you can contract with someone you're living with,
Hmm.
whether you're married to them or not, whether you
Right.
want to be considered married to them or not.
Hmm.
Like you might just want to be roommates,
Yeah.
but you can do a cohabitation agreement because what if someone wants to leave?
Hmm.
What if it's a purchase and someone wants their equity out of the purchase?
Yeah.
And so these contracts are very unique tools that we could employ across the board for a number of different individuals, but
Yeah.
specifically for same-sex couples.
Yeah. So, and I think it's good to recognize that there are a lot of things that we don't have answers to right now, but we do know that we do have some tools in the toolbox as we sit here today that we can use more creatively
Mhm.
to address some of the concerns that may be coming up now that we don't know what's going to happen to the recognition of certain relationships.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
just knowing that you're not out there by yourself, it doesn't mean that there's no way to protect anything that we've
yeah,
done. There
yeah,
are. It may just take a few extra steps. It takes a little bit of work,
yeah.
but that's okay.
And honestly, I like to stress this. Tiffany has heard me say this more than once.
Yeah.
But that's why we're counselors of law
Hmm.
because we do have to get creative
Yeah.
in counseling our clients, and it's called a practice
Hmm.
because there's not always one solution.
Yeah.
Despite how many laws that are written in black ink on white
Hmm.
paper, we live in the gray. We live in the
Hmm.
gray, and so we can get creative because we're in the gray.
Yeah.
And I just want to stress that, if someone is concerned, please consider putting down the headlines that you see in the news,
Hmm.
put down your phone, get off
Hmm.
Facebook for a minute. And if you're
Hmm.
truly scared, sit down with a trusted family law attorney,
Yes.
an estate planning attorney,
Yeah.
and really decide for your own family situation what you think is best.
Exactly. Like, talk with them about what your concerns are. What are your biggest fears? Because that's where we start to then work backwards into, okay, what are some plans that we can put in
Hmm.
place to avoid those fears?
Yep.
And if there are some fears that we can't 100% address, we'll let you know that too.
Hmm.
But this is as close as we can get right now.
Yeah.
And as things continue to shift, then we can come back and reassess and say, okay, what can we do now?
Yep.
What have we learned since the last time we talked that we can use now to better protect you moving forward?
Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and jump in on one of those things that I've thought about that we may not really have direction on, and that has to do with parental rights.
Yeah.
Because different laws apply to many a different situation. I like to joke that one day I am going to become a law professor. I'm going to teach family law. And my first question to the classroom is going to
Hmm.
be, what is the legal definition of a parent?
Mm,
And I say that because there is no legal definition of
one.
a parent.
No,
There isn't.
there's not.
And so when we already have a lack of a definition, and this has existed the whole time
Forever. Right.
we've been here
Right.
as a
But being
nation.
considered a legal parent brings about a lot of
Right?
rights and
Exactly.
protections. It's an interesting concept.
It is an interesting concept, but
Hmm.
the lack of it means that sometimes a prospective client will ask me a question
Hmm.
about parental rights, and I'll have to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I don't know how to guide a client, right? We can
Right.
still see what we want to pursue. So, for example, in a custody action between two parents, a quote unquote traditional custody action, if you will,
Hmm.
oh, we can give a lot of guidance, right?
Yeah.
We can't guarantee what a judge will order, but we can give a lot of guidance and
Right.
honestly, most times settle.
Yeah.
But with these possible changes in the law at
Hmm.
the constitutional level, that's where we are going to be blunt and say we don't know necessarily how this is going to have a ripple effect when it
Right.
comes to parental rights, specifically when it comes to same-sex relationships.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So because there's some differences. So you may have a same sex couple who never married,
Hmm.
and they still wanted to grow their family, which many people do, whether you're in a same-sex couple or not. But it's particularly problematic for same-sex couples, because one of the ways that you would protect or create the legal position of a parent is to adopt. And
Mhm.
that may not necessarily be available to a same-sex couple because they are not married. And
Mhm.
that is one particular rule within North Carolina that there is no way around.
Mhm.
So we may have to be creative and then look to, okay, well, what type of contractual things do we have in our toolbox that we can use to still protect the non-biological parents' rights and access to this child that they were 100% a part of bringing into this world,
Mhm.
wanting, loving, and building that relationship with.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's critical. I'll just touch on right there that the statutes prevent us from doing
correct.
that, right, as
Yeah.
a legal system.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is this competing, what we call case law,
Mm-hmm.
and those are rulings from the courts, the higher up courts here in North Carolina, that can still take into consideration those contracts
Mm-hmm.
as it's not necessarily binding law, but I should say binding circumstances that create that parental relationship.
Correct.
And a court is going to recognize that parental relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because what the law does say is that we shall do whatever is in the best interest of the child.
Correct. Right.
And that takes into consideration all of that.
Exactly. So, we've got situations where, both parents were actively engaged. It just so happens that only one of them is biologically connected to this child. They are not going to discount or discredit or completely ignore the years and the relationship that was built by the non-biological parent with that child
Yeah.
and the relationship that that child has with that non-biological parent, more importantly.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I
Yeah,
like
I
to
do.
say all the time, when families come into the courtroom, judges are the grandparents. They don't care about the parents,
Yeah.
the adults that are in front of them. They don't really care about that. What is going on with this child or these children?
Yep.
What's going to impact them? What is going to harm them? What is going to benefit them?
Mm-hmm.
And have there been things in the past that we've seen have been very beneficial for these children? If there are, I'm not going to change that.
Yeah.
They're not looking to strip children of things that have been beneficial to them.
Yeah. So I would say at the end of the day, yes, the political sphere, the legal sphere, there's a lot of things changing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are concerned about a lot of things.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, I would say there are a number of family law attorneys and estate planning attorneys, such as ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
who really do care about families,
Yeah.
want to protect the family structure, and want to protect children along the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And just like everybody's family is different,
Mm-hmm.
your solutions are going to be different as
Yep.
well.
Agreed.
And so sitting down, being upfront, being honest with the attorney that you're working with and saying, hey, listen, these are my concerns. This is our situation. I just want as many protections as possible, as many safety nets as possible, so that if worst case scenario happens, I still know what this is going to look like
Yeah.
when I open my eyes the next day.
Well, thank you, Tiffany, for sitting with me in the legal lounge and
Yeah.
tackling this topic today. Of course, for the viewers, if you have any questions or want to reach out to a member of our team, let us know. We are here for you day in and day out. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our discussion. To learn more about me and the Modern Legal team, go to our website, modernlegalnc.com, or check out the links in our show notes to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also call us at 704-286-6302. If you have been intrigued by the conversation and would like us to continue our discussions, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. See you next time.